March 21st, 1987. A freezing silence hung over the San Bernardino Mountains in California. The snowstorm was so intense that the line between the sky and the earth had completely vanished. For 3 agonizing days, search and rescue helicopters had been scanning that white void, desperate for a glint of metal, a sign of life, anything that could explain the impossible. Down below, under the artificial glow of Los Angeles, a man known to millions as the King of Cool was living through the longest night of his existence. Dean Martin sat in a room filled with shadows, holding a glass where the ice had long since melted into warm water. A cigarette burned itself out in the ashtray, the smoke curling up like a ghost. The world knew him as the man who didn't care, the man who laughed at life, the legend who could charm a crowd with a single raise of an eyebrow. But that night, the man in the chair was not the tuxedoed god of Las Vegas. That night, he was just a father, waiting for a phone call that he prayed would never come, yet knew was inevitable. Logically, Dean Martin should have been untouchable. He had dined with mob bosses, joked with presidents, and commanded the most powerful studios in Hollywood. He had survived the poverty of Steubenville, the breakup with Jerry Lewis, and the changing tides of the music industry. He was the man who walked through rain without getting wet. But as he stared at the silent telephone, he realized that all the fame, all the money, and all the connections in the world were utterly useless against the brutality of fate. The mountains didn't care who he was. The storm didn't care about his records. And death, as it turned out, was the only visitor that didn't need a reservation at the sands. To understand why this moment broke the man that nothing else could break, you have to understand who was missing in that storm. It wasn't just a pilot. It was Dean Paul Martin, his son, his golden boy. Dino was everything Dean had ever hoped to be, but without the scars of the past. He was handsome, talented, a professional tennis player, a Golden Globe-nominated actor, and a captain in the California Air National Guard. He was the tangible proof that the Martin legacy was more than just smoke and mirrors. Dean loved all his children, but Dino was his reflection in a mirror that showed no cracks. When Dean looked at him, he didn't see the boozy, tired singer. He saw the best version of himself. 3 days earlier, Dino had climbed into the cockpit of an F-4C Phantom jet. It was a routine training mission. He was the best pilot in his unit. He had flown thousands of hours. The machine was a beast of engineering, capable of tearing through the sky at twice the speed of sound. But nature is a beast that cannot be tamed. The storm had rolled in with a violence that blinded the sensors and confused the instruments. According to the radar data that was later analyzed in hushed tones by military officials, the jet had inverted. Disoriented by the whiteout, Dino likely thought he was climbing towards the safety of the heavens. In reality, he was diving straight into the granite heart of the mountain. He hit the rock at 400 miles per hour. There was no pain, there was no fear, just an instant, absolute end. But Dean Martin didn't know that yet. For 3 days he sat in that chair. He didn't eat, he barely spoke. He just waited. The friends who tried to comfort him, Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., saw a look in his eyes they had never seen before. It wasn't sadness, it was a void. It was as if the light behind his eyes had been turned off by a switch. When the phone finally rang, the sound was like a gunshot in the quiet house. Dean picked it up. He listened for less than 10 seconds. He put the receiver down slowly, with a terrifying calmness. He didn't scream. He didn't throw the glass against the wall. He just whispered 2 words into the darkness. Why him? That moment was the death of Dean Martin. The body would keep walking, the lungs would keep breathing for another 8 years, but the man, the spirit, the King of Cool, died in that chair the moment he heard they had found the wreckage. The autopsy reports were sealed, but the reality was brutal. There was nothing left to bury. The violence of the impact had been absolute. For a man who built his life on family, on the Italian tradition of Sunday dinners and protecting his own, the inability to even say goodbye to his son's face was a torture that Dante himself could not have devised. The funeral was a blur of black limousines and flashing cameras. The world mourned a celebrity's son, but Dean mourned his future. Observers noticed something chilling that day. Dean looked like he had aged 20 years in 20 minutes. His shoulders, usually squared with that effortless confidence, were slumped. His face, always ready with a half smile, was a mask of gray stone. Frank Sinatra stood by his side, trying to be the pillar of strength, trying to be the chairman of the board who fixes everything. But Frank knew, deep down, that this was the one thing he couldn't fix. He couldn't call a favor. He couldn't make a deal. Death didn't negotiate. After the funeral, Dean retreated. He withdrew into a silence so profound it frightened those around him. He stopped playing golf. He stopped going to his favorite restaurants. He sat in his den, watching old westerns on loop, the volume turned down low. He watched cowboys ride into the sunset, solving problems with a gun and a code of honor, a simplicity that no longer existed in his shattered world. He began to drink, not for fun, not for the show like he used to, but to numb the screaming silence in his head. The joy was gone. The spark was extinguished. But Hollywood and the business of show business are cruel masters. They don't allow legends to grieve in peace. A year later, Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. came up with an idea. They called it the Together Again Tour. It was supposed to be the triumphant return of the Rat Pack. It was supposed to be a stadium-filling, money-printing machine that would remind the world who owned the night. Frank thought it would save Dean. He thought that getting him back on stage, back under the lights, back with the boys, would reignite the fire. He was wrong. The tour began in Oakland in March of 1988. From the very first night, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. Frank was energized, fighting against his own aging body with sheer force of will. Sammy, who was secretly battling the throat cancer that would soon kill him, was dancing with the energy of a man half his age. But Dean was a ghost. He walked onto the stage and the applause was deafening, but he wasn't there. He went through the motions. He sang the songs, but the voice was thin, hollow. He missed cues. He forgot lyrics. But it wasn't the charming, "I am too drunk to care" act of the past. It was the confusion of a man who didn't want to be there. The breaking point came in Chicago. It was a cold night, much like the one that took his son. The stadium was packed, thousands of people screaming for the legends. Frank was in his element, barking orders at the orchestra, feeding off the crowd's energy. Dean stood by the piano, a cigarette burning in his hand. He looked out at the sea of faces, and for the first time, he felt nothing. No love, no hate, no amusement, just an overwhelming exhaustion. He realized he was performing for ghosts. He realized that the applause sounded like static. In the middle of the show, Dean did something that violated every code of professionalism he had upheld for 40 years. He flicked his cigarette onto the stage floor, ground it out with the heel of his boot, and looked at Frank. He didn't use the microphone. He didn't need to. His eyes said everything. He walked off the stage. He didn't bow. He didn't wave. He just walked away into the shadows of the wings. Frank was furious. He felt betrayed. He felt that Dean had quit on him, quit on the brotherhood. There was a confrontation in the hotel later that night. Shouting, accusations, the kind of ugly scene that happens when two brothers realize they have become strangers. Dean flew home to Los Angeles the next morning. He never performed in a stadium again. He never spoke to Frank Sinatra again with the same warmth. The friendship that had defined an era, the bond that was supposed to be unbreakable, shattered under the weight of grief that Dean refused to share and Frank couldn't understand. Frank wanted to fight death. Dean wanted to surrender to it. The last years of Dean Martin's life were a study in solitude. He became a recluse in the city he had helped build. He would go to dinner at his favorite Italian restaurant, La Famiglia, every night. He would sit at the same table, alone. The waiters knew not to disturb him. They knew to bring his pasta and his wine and then disappear. Patrons would whisper, "That is Dean Martin," but nobody dared to approach him. He had an aura of sadness that acted like a force field. He wasn't the drunk legends made him out to be in those final years. In fact, many nights he would nurse a single glass of wine for hours. He was simply waiting. He spent his days watching the world change through the window of his Beverly Hills home. He saw the rise of new stars who didn't have half his talent but had twice his hunger. He saw the music industry turn into something he didn't recognize. But he didn't care. He had checked out on March 21st, 1987. Everything that happened after was just a postscript, a long, slow fade to black. His health began to fail. Years of smoking caught up with his lungs. The doctors told him he had emphysema. They told him he had lung cancer. They told him he needed treatment, surgery, radiation. Dean looked at them with that same half smile, the one that used to make women faint, and shook his head. He refused the surgery. He refused the fight. Why prolong a life that had lost its meaning? There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps true, that in his final weeks, Frank Sinatra tried to visit him. Frank stood outside the door, the most powerful entertainer in the world, a man who had links to the White House and the Mafia, and he couldn't bring himself to ring the bell. He knew Dean didn't want to see him. He knew Dean didn't want to be seen dying. So Frank left, leaving a silence between them that would last until eternity. On Christmas Day, 1995, exactly 29 years to the day after he had married his third wife, and exactly 8 years after his son's death, Dean Martin took his final breath. It was fitting, in a tragic, poetic way. The man who had given the world so much joy, so much music, left the world on the day of celebration. The lights of the Las Vegas Strip, the city he had ruled, were dimmed in his honor. For 10 minutes, the neon jungle went dark. It was the only tribute that made sense. The man who lit up the room had left the building. But the tragedy of Dean Martin isn't just about death. It's about the illusion of the American dream. He had it all. He climbed from the gritty streets of Ohio to the absolute pinnacle of global fame. He had the money, the women, the adoration. And yet, in the end, none of it could save the one thing that mattered. His story is a brutal reminder that behind the velvet curtain, behind the clinking glasses and the laughter of the Rat Pack, there were real men with real, breaking hearts. Dean's legacy is often simplified. People remember the drunk act, the jokes, the tuxedo. But the real Dean Martin was the man in the chair, waiting for his son. He was the man who walked off stage in Chicago because he refused to fake it anymore. He was the man who chose dignity over survival. In a world that constantly demanded more fame, more money, more noise, Dean Martin had the courage to say, enough. He left us with a question that still haunts the corridors of Hollywood history. What is the price of cool? How much do you have to suppress? How much do you have to hide to maintain that facade of effortless perfection? Dean paid the price in silence. He took his pain to the grave, leaving us only with the recordings of a voice that sounded like smooth velvet wrapped around a jagged rock. His death marked the true end of the mid-century era. The Rat Pack was gone. The style, the swagger, the unwritten code of male friendship that defined a generation dissolved with him. Frank would linger on for a few more years, fighting his own battles with memory and rage, but without Dean, the balance was lost. Dean was the anchor. He was the one who didn't need the applause, which is exactly why the applause followed him. When they cleared out his house, they found it remarkably empty of memorabilia. He didn't have shrines to himself. He didn't have walls covered in gold records. The only things that seemed to matter, the only things that showed wear and tear, were the old Western videotapes and a few photos of a young man in a flight suit, smiling at the camera with the same eyes as his father. Dean Martin's life was a performance of ease, but his end was a testament to the weight of love. He didn't die of cancer. He died of a broken heart. It is a medical impossibility, perhaps, but a poetic certainty. The lungs failed because the breath had been knocked out of him 8 years prior on a snowy mountain. The heart stopped because it had nothing left to beat for. So, The next time you hear "Everybody Loves Somebody" playing on a jukebox in a dim bar, or you see a clip of him roasting Frank Sinatra with that devilish grin, remember the silence. Remember the snow. Remember the man who sat in the chair and watched his world end, and then, quietly, politely, waited for his turn to leave. But history is never just about one man. The threads of the Rat Pack were woven together with steel and blood. Dean's exit left Frank Sinatra alone on the throne, a king without his knights. And as Frank looked around his lonely kingdom, his mind didn't go to the future. It went back to the past, to the secrets that were buried even deeper than Dean's grief. It went back to a blonde woman, a president, and a telephone line that was tapped by the mafia. Frank Sinatra knew where the bodies were buried because he had held the shovel. And the biggest secret of all wasn't about Dean or Sammy or the music. It was about the night Marilyn Monroe died. Frank knew the truth. He knew who was in the house. He knew who made the call. And he knew that the official story was a lie, constructed to save the most powerful family in America. Dean Martin took his pain to the grave. Frank Sinatra took his secrets to the brink of madness. The connection between the mob, the White House, and the death of Hollywood's greatest goddess is a web of deceit that we are only now beginning to untangle. Dean's tragedy was personal. Frank's tragedy was political. And Marilyn, her tragedy was that she trusted them both. The file on Marilyn isn't closed. It never was. The whispers from that era are getting louder. And in the next file, we are going to open the door that Frank Sinatra spent his entire life trying to keep shut. We are going to walk into the bedroom of the most famous woman in the world, and we are going to look at the evidence that the history books were too afraid to print. Dean is gone, but the ghosts he left behind are still talking, and they have a hell of a story to tell. Join me in the next dossier, where we uncover the night the music stopped for Marilyn and the mob made its boldest move yet. This is Legends Confidential.